Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, or good evening, whichever the case may be, wherever you are. And welcome to this webcast on disclosure of disability status in the workplace. This webcast is sponsored by the Rehabilitation Research and Training Center on Physical Disabilities at Virginia Commonwealth University, supported by a grant from the National Institute on Disability, Independent Living, and Rehabilitation Research. I'm Phil Rumrill. I'm a professor of rehabilitation counseling and director of the Center for Disability Studies at Kent State University in Ohio. I'm delighted to be here with you today to talk about this most important issue in the lives of Americans with disabilities, and that is the issue of disclosure. Knowing whether to disclose one's disability to his or her employer, either while on the job or during an application or during a job interview, knowing what to disclose, and perhaps just as importantly, knowing when to make that initial disclosure constitute very important, highly personal, and often complicated decisions for Americans with disabilities. On one hand, the decision to disclose can bring with it benefits such as accessing legal protections in federal laws like the Americans with Disabilities Act and the Family and Medical Leave Act. On the other hand, there are risks associated with disclosure, such as the relinquishment of one's privacy and possible reactions on the part of coworkers and employers that might not be viewed as desirable by the person who made the disclosure. So we'll get into those issues today. We're going to talk about some commonly asked questions about disclosure that people with disabilities have presented to us in our clinical work. Also, we'll share the findings of numerous research studies we've been involved with over the years that have to do with this issue of disclosure. Before proceeding, I want to thank Dr. Paul Wayman and his team at Virginia Commonwealth University and Dr. Jim Krause and his team at the Medical University of South Carolina, both principals in the Rehabilitation Research and Training Center on Physical Disabilities, for including me in their research related to the employment of people with disabilities, and for inviting me to conduct this seminar, this webcast today. And the findings that we'll be discussing today from the research projects are supported from grants from both the National Institute on Disability, Independent Living, and Rehabilitation Research, as I mentioned before, and also the National Multiple Sclerosis Society. So let's take a look at this issue of disclosure and present it in a context of how important an issue it is for Americans with disabilities. And any of the references that I cite in my remarks here will be included on the actual web page that accompanies this telecast. So you can reference that page for any of the references that we talk about. We know that a study by Vickers in 2012 revealed that disclosure of disability was one of the top 5 employment concerns cited by employed Americans with disabilities. So this is a very prominent issue in the minds of people with disabilities. A couple of studies that we've been involved with over the years reveal very similar findings. Here at Kent State University, we have a program called the MS Employment Assistance Service. And since 1999, we've worked with more than 2,500 people with MS, providing telephonic and online employment and career-related consultation. Fully 20% of all the inquiries that we received from people with MS nationwide in this service over the years have had something to do with this issue of disclosure. So you can see here again that this is a major issue. Another article that we published a few years ago, the results of a national survey of the employment concerns of Americans with multiple sclerosis, revealed that of about 2,000 people responded to this survey. And in that study, of the 6 most prominent sources of dissatisfaction among employed people with MS regarding the world of work, 3 of those issues had to do with disclosure. Majorities of respondents in that survey were dissatisfied with their knowledge of the risks and benefits associated with disclosing disability in the workplace. Also were dissatisfied with their knowledge of the process by which one would request reasonable accommodations in the workplace, and were dissatisfied with their abilities to participate in a review of their accommodation needs as a means of implementing reasonable accommodations. And why is this issue of reasonable accommodation linked so closely to that of disclosure? It gets back to the requirements of the Americans with Disabilities Act, which was amended in 2008 as per the Americans with Disabilities Act Amendments Act. So I'll refer to the ADA-AA. The ADA-AA says that people with disabilities are under no legal obligation to disclose their disability to employers unless they have a need for a reasonable accommodation in the workplace. So this is very, very important, and many disability advocates have gone so far as to recommend that people with disabilities not disclose their disability status until or unless they have a need for a reasonable accommodation. Now, there may be other reasons why one would want to disclose prior to that issue, the issue of accommodations. And some of these include if you have a disability that is apparent to the employer and you want to explain that for any reason, that is up to you, and you can do that at any time. But employers are precluded legally from asking questions about health or disability on application forms or during job interviews. If you request an accommodation from the employer and you've not yet disclosed your disability, the employer can then inquire about your disability status, because you need to have a disability in order to be eligible for reasonable accommodations. An employer may inquire as to your ability to do the job, even referencing an obvious or apparent disability during an interview or at any time. The employer could say, for example, you're here interviewing for this job, and this is a job as a filing clerk, and I see that you use a wheelchair, and can you show me then how you would perform the function of filing, because you have to put files up on a higher shelf, or would this be something that for which you would need an accommodation? Because of the apparent nature of the disability and because of the fact that the employer is asking about it in terms of the essential functions of that particular position, the employer could inquire on that basis, but may not inquire as to the underlying nature of your health status or disability. So it's kind of an important distinction there, and understanding that people with disabilities don't have to disclose until or unless they need reasonable accommodations really elevates the importance of the accommodation request process as it is linked to this issue of disclosure. So with that said, let's consider some of the most commonly asked questions about disclosure that people with disabilities have. These are drawn from a number of sources, including intervention programs and direct service projects that we have operated over the years with a variety of disability populations. So one of the most common questions is, I have just arranged an interview for a new job. Can my prospective employer ask me questions about my disability during the interview? And if so, what can he or she ask? So here again, as I had mentioned earlier, the employer may not ask questions directly about your disability status during the job interview. You're only obligated to disclose your disability if you foresee a need for a reasonable accommodation on the job. Now, in the case of an obvious disability, as we had mentioned earlier, the employer may inquire about how you would perform the functions of the job, but on application forms or during job interviews, no questions about health or disability may be asked. This is a very, very important thing to understand, and also this notion of accommodation and how your needs for accommodation play into that interview. Probably the most common advice is that If your disability does not affect your ability to do the job and is not readily apparent to the employer, there's usually no good reason to disclose your disability during an interview. At the time you detect a need for an accommodation, you may wish to disclose at that time your disability status, that is, and to let the employer know that you would not only that you have a disability, but also that you would need accommodations to perform that particular function. It's important to understand that by requesting a reasonable accommodation, you are conceding that you can't perform that particular function of the job without the accommodation. So you have to be prepared to implement whatever accommodation might assist you in performing the job. The issue of qualification also comes into play here. And it's important to note that by disclosing disability status, you're also saying I have a disability, but I'm also qualified for the position that I'm applying for or the position that I currently hold. And qualified means that you are capable of performing the essential functions of the job either with reasonable accommodations or without them. It doesn't mean with and without, it means it with accommodations if needed. So during that interview, if your disability does not pose any foreseeable issues that would require accommodation, it's generally better not to disclose at that particular time. At the point you detect the need for an accommodation, though, that's when the issue of disclosure arises. Now, we have had people we work with who will say sometimes, but I don't want to withhold that from the employer. It's dishonest to do that. It's something that I deal with, I'm not ashamed of it, and I want them to I want to be upfront with them, and I can expect them to be upfront with me. And that's certainly one strategy if you choose to approach it from that point of view. But there is a tendency among many people with disabilities to over-disclose, sometimes tell too much information, and the downside of over-disclosure is it can activate reactions on the part of employers and coworkers that you can't control. Some of those reactions can be stigmatizing. I had one person with a physical disability I was working with once who said that after he told his employer about his condition, it was a neurological condition that caused problems with his mobility, he noted that the employer began to scrutinize his work more heavily, set lower expectations for him, and he eventually decided to stop working because the dynamic that was put in place from that disclosure was really uncomfortable for him. So the benefit is you're putting your information out there, you're being upfront, you're being straightforward. The risk can be that you never get that privacy back if you make a full disclosure. We sometimes suggest to people that think of disability not as something as a matter of honesty, but as a matter of your own personal business. If you were having trouble in your marriage or your relationship, would you choose to share that with your employer, even if it were true? Most people would say probably not. How about the church you go to? Or if your children were having health problems, or were in trouble in school or in the community, those kinds of things. Or if you were having financial difficulties. Even though those things may be true, you're not obligated to tell your employer, and so many people choose to keep that information to themselves as a matter of privacy. It's also important to note that to activate the provisions of the Family and Medical Leave Act, if you need unpaid family and medical leave for a serious health condition, your employer does have the right to know that you have that condition. It just makes logical sense. And also can request documentation of what the FMLA calls your serious health condition, not disability per se. So with that disclosure, if you need a time off under the FMLA, it can be a request on the employer's part for documentation. Here's another question. When checking my references, can a potential employer inquire about how my health or disability has affected my job performance? And the answer to this question is absolutely not. We don't need to spend much more time on that one. A potential employer cannot inquire with past employers or past associates about your health or disability status, and it is illegal to make those inquiries. So you can rest assured that employers will not be asking those kinds of questions and following up during the job interview or application process. Here's another question. I was just offered a job and the employer told me that I had to submit to a physical examination. What rules regarding disclosure apply to medical examinations? This is an interesting issue because it's a different type of disclosure and you're disclosing to the physician, not to the employer. The answer to this question is you must take the physical exam and you must be honest with the physician. The physician, however, may not share diagnostic information about your health or disability with the employer who has ordered the exam. The physician can only indicate whether you are physically and psychologically capable of performing the essential functions of that job. More importantly, or at least as importantly, the physical examination has to be job specific. Let's suppose that you've applied for a job as a telephonic case manager. The examining physician can ask you questions about whether you could operate a telephone headset, whether you could enter data from the computer or speak clearly on the telephone, etc. The examining physician may not ask you if you could lift 50 pounds over your head, because that is not required of a telephonic case manager, or in most cases it would not be. So they can only ask you questions about your health as it pertains to the job that you are seeking. Post-offer medical examinations can also not be given selectively. They have to be required of all applicants or they can be given to no applicants. So if they suspect that you have a disability, they can't single you out for that examination. So the post-offer nature of the exam is important to understand. They have to make the offer first. It's important to understand you have to be honest with the physician, as long as you understand what the physician's limitations are in terms of what he or she can report to the employer. And it's also important to understand that following the physical examination, the employer can make a determination as to whether you can perform the essential function of that job. If you cannot, you would be deemed unqualified for the job, and the employer may rescind that offer, provided that the employer has considered reasonable accommodations that would allow you to perform those functions. So it gets a little complicated, but the short answer around disclosure on medical examinations is be honest, be forthcoming, and know that that the examining physician cannot share diagnostic or disability-specific related information with the employer in his or her report. Can only report whether you're able to do that job, and that's an important distinction. Here's another question. If I decide to disclose my disability, do I have to mention anything about my diagnosis? The answer here is no, and we strongly recommend that you focus on the functional aspects of your disability. People will often talk about if they have a neurological disorder, let's say multiple sclerosis, they might choose to say, I have problems with my left leg, and here's how I accommodate it with the use of a mobility cane or some other device. So here, it's very important to talk about functional aspects of your condition, because really it's about your functioning as a worker. That's what's most important to the employer, and that's what's most important to these discussions. If you need to couple your disclosure with an accommodation request, it's always better to know exactly and specifically what accommodation you need or what you'd be seeking to help you continue to do the job. You're much more likely to get an accommodation from an employer if you know specifically what it is that you want and how that will help you to maintain your productivity on the job. So we find employers accommodating of disability, provided that the employee can cast those functional issues that he or she might be having within the context of how an accommodation will help him or her to maintain productivity on the job. So staying positive and focusing on function would be the two suggestions I would make there. Here's another question. What do I need to tell my coworkers about my disability? I'm sure you can imagine by now that your coworkers have no legal right to know anything about your health or disability status, and it is generally good advice to limit how much discussion of health and disability we share with our colleagues and coworkers. Having said that, we recognize that our coworkers are often friends, they're often supporters, and they're concerned about us, and sometimes these issues come up, in various ways. It's important for you as a person with a disability to make that decision based on your own comfort level within the workplace, the role you play with your friends and colleagues at work, and understanding that you may be engaging reactions on the part of coworkers ranging from sympathy you don't want to scrutiny that is not warranted, to considerations about equity considerations about whether you're pulling your weight, so to speak, and holding up your end of the job if you're in a team sort of concept in the workplace. And so and then the other issue is you don't know who the coworkers will they tell other coworkers, etc. So that issue of maintaining your own right to privacy until or unless you're absolutely sure you want that information out there and making that decision on your own is very, very important. Understand, however, there's no legal obligation to share health or disability-related information with coworkers, and our experience tells us that it's best to limit that information to every extent possible. That way you're maintaining your own right to privacy and you're minimizing the risks of disclosing to people who don't have the right to know. Let's shift gears slightly. I want to share with you some findings from a very interesting study of the disclosure decision that was conducted with 74 people with multiple sclerosis in 3 states, South Carolina, Georgia, and Ohio. These results are presented in an article that is currently in press with the Journal of Vocational Rehabilitation, written by Carla Reed and others at the Medical University of South Carolina. This was a qualitative focus group investigation in which the 74 participants, all of whom had been diagnosed with multiple sclerosis, and all of whom had some employment experience following their diagnosis with MS. They were asked one main probing question, and that is, did you decide to disclose your MS to your employer? And if so, what impact did that disclosure have on your ability to find or maintain employment? So we were really looking in this particular study to get at the factors that influence that disclosure decision, what goes into the process of making that decision, whether to disclose or not, and then what were the consequences of that decision to disclose or not on your ongoing career development in terms of either acquiring employment or in maintaining employment and continuing your career. So we looked at the results and we cataloged and categorized all of the narrative responses from participants in these focus groups into those 2 categories. So all responses had to do either with the decision to disclose or the consequences of disclosure. And let's look first at the themes that emerged in the responses from participants related to that initial disclosure decision. Did you decide to disclose your MS to your employer? A number of respondents in this study felt it incumbent upon themselves to not only explain how MS affected them in their particular jobs, but also to educate their employers about, in this case, about multiple sclerosis. And several of the participants in this study remarked that they had people from the National Multiple Sclerosis Society come into the workplace and discuss MS with coworkers and supervisors. And of course, this decision around preparing the employer, educating the employer, and explaining MS in many ways goes beyond the person's legal obligation in terms of disclosure, but these participants in particular felt that this was a responsibility of theirs, that if they were, one participant said, if I'm going to ask my employer to accommodate me, I think it's important that she understand fully what MS is and how it affects me. So this is one of those areas where it doesn't have anything to do with a legal obligation. People are doing this really as a courtesy, and they saw that as really as part of their responsibility. So the disclosure decision as an element of responsibility as an employee was one theme that came up in making that initial disclosure decision. Very interesting. The second theme under this decision to disclose had to do with comments that reflected no concern on the part of participants. We found this to be a very interesting finding, and a good number of participants noted no concern in making that decision. Many of the comments had to do with participants' perspective that making this disclosure was really not a big deal and didn't require the kind of forethought that we've actually been talking about here in our time together so far in this webcast. One respondent noted that he hadn't given the matter much thought at all. He just decided to mention that he had MS soon after his diagnosis, and he wasn't concerned about the consequences of it at the time, and the employer seemed to react kind of neutrally to the whole thing, and so he described this as just something that he felt he needed to do, without much more explanation than that. Several other participants took a similar position. One person remarked that to her, her MS was mild in terms of the symptoms and the range of effects that it had on her, and because it wasn't a major intrusion into her life, the issue of disclosure was an easy one because she really felt like she had nothing to hide. Another interesting observation from that participant. Alternatively, the third theme under the disclosure decision had to do with participants' choice to delay or limit or avoid disclosure altogether. And many of the reasons that participants cited for not disclosing initially had to do with the very rights to privacy that we've been talking about up to this point in the webcast. They had to do with the fear of stigmatization, the fear of unwanted scrutiny, the fear of unwanted inquiries into their health status, people minding their business, as one person put it, and the fear of discrimination on the basis of disability. So those were some of the reasons why people chose to delay disclosing. Other people chose to delay disclosing their disability because they didn't require any accommodations and they knew that they were under no obligation to disclose, so that was another reason for that choice to delay. Several participants, unfortunately, gave very good reasons in retrospect for choosing to limit the people to whom you would disclose in the workplace, because several people mentioned that they had disclosed their MS to one or two coworkers, and then the coworkers told other coworkers and the supervisor, and those kinds of situations often cause difficulty, and in one case led to a person choosing to stop working because the gossip and the informal channels and information, the disclosure kind of got out of her hands, if that makes any sense. And so choosing to limit the people to whom you disclose, kind of like we talked about before in deciding whether to disclose to coworkers or not, when you tell one person, even if they're suggesting they'll keep it in confidence, that's not always the case. And so holding on to your own privacy as long as you feel that you need or want to becomes very important here. So we had a significant theme here in this study of people choosing to delay or limit or not disclose at all for many of these reasons. The final theme under the disclosure decision had to do with uncertainty about future disclosures. And so for people who had not yet disengaged from the workforce, there was a considerable amount of discussion and uncertainty about whether they would disclose in the future based on their experiences. And for some of these folks, it was that they had disclosed in the past, it didn't work out very well, and that made them less likely to disclose in the future. For other people, even though their employers had been positive, they weren't confident that other and subsequent employers would be accommodating as well. So there was a good bit of uncertainty about that, and a lot of questions that people had regarding the availability and the types of accommodations, and how do you go about identifying the accommodations you need to couple with disclosure, making that accommodation request. Here, several participants recommended contacting the Job Accommodation Network at West Virginia University, one of our nation's finest vocational rehabilitation services funded by the United States Department of Labor. The Job Accommodation Network has an extensive repository of accommodations that can be used by people with various disabilities and in various work settings, a toll-free, free telephonic service, as well as a web-based portal for information around accommodations, and a lot of guidance around this disclosure decision that we're talking about here today. So several participants mentioned the Job Accommodation Network as an important resource in helping to clarify that uncertainty about the future. The most prominent theme in the consequences category had to do with positive and supportive reactions of coworkers and supervisors. And for us, this was very encouraging news to learn that so many respondents had had positive experiences and positive reactions from their employers. So we heard numerous testimonials that they disclosed their disability, coworkers were supportive, they were helpful, they pitched in, some loaned paid leave time that the person could take if he or she needed it. Supervisors would allow them accommodations such as working at home, abbreviating or modifying their work schedules, things of that nature. And so for a lot of participants in this particular study, they made the disclosure, found the employer to be supportive, particularly when participants noted when they were forthcoming with information about MS and what it was about, if they got the National Multiple Sclerosis Society involved in conducting in-services about MS in the workplace. And so for these folks, where they had a supportive and positive work environment, they would attribute an open and forthcoming disclosure as part of the reason for that positive response on the part of employers. Others mentioned that the employers they worked for at the time of disclosure were supportive in general of employees, whether people were needing time off for other reasons, to attend to child care or family health care matters and things of that nature. And so they felt that the environment would be conducive to a disclosure of disability and a discussion of accommodation needs. And they in fact found that to be true in many cases, that employers were supportive and responsive. So now 25 years into the implementation of the original ADA, and nearly 10 years into implementation of the ADA Amendments Act, it's encouraging to hear that there were so many positive and supportive responses from employers to this particular sample's disclosure of MS. Now the second theme under the category of consequences of disclosure is really straightforward and doesn't require much discussion. It really centers on a response from the employer that had no consequence, either positive or negative. So going to that no big deal kind of feeling that people expressed in making the original decision to disclose, the same consequence was felt, that disclosure really didn't bring about any consequence in either direction to the employee, to the respondent in this particular case. The third theme had to do with mixed or variable reactions on the part of employers to the person's disclosure. So a number of respondents suggested that sometimes the employers seemed very receptive and supportive of the disclosure that the person made, and then 2 weeks later would do things that would seem less receptive and less accommodating, etc. So very supportive and caring and concerned when people mentioned the first disclosure, and then coworkers might be asking too often, are you okay? Is everything all right? Information about their health status then gets circulated through informal channels in the workplace, through the gossip mill, etc. The employer expresses a positive reaction to the disclosure, says whatever I can do to help, in the words of one respondent, and then started assigning that person to undesirable job tasks, increasing her hours in this particular case, and making the workplace an environment where she really didn't want to continue. So what we see sometimes is that the initial reaction of employers can be very positive and then can change throughout the person's work experience, and people noted this. They also noted sometimes that employers would react in a way that didn't seem to be very positive, in fact seemed negative or suspicious or somewhat oppositional. And then over time, as they realized that the person could find ways to accommodate his or her MS in the workplace, was going to be open and forthright, and the employer essentially, for lack of a better word, came around to being more accommodating and more receptive to the person's needs. So sometimes the response to disclosure is not a straight line, either positive or negative, and can vary depending on situation, depending on the effects of the disability and how they're manifesting themselves, depending on circumstances within the workplace, economic factors, whether business is good or business is not so good, other dynamics in the workplace and things of that nature. So we did see this theme of the reaction being sort of variable over time, and that's worth noting and thinking about as people contemplate the disclosure decision, is that employer responses will sometimes vary, just as they would to any other circumstance or any other situation. It's not always going to be the same, either really positive or neutral or really negative. It kind of comes and goes. And so that was captured in this third theme under the consequence area. The fourth and final theme had to do with the disclosure decision leading to the person's termination of employment. Interestingly, most often the choice to terminate employment was made by the person himself or herself. So the person, in several cases, would talk about having disclosed disability and then either being denied reasonable accommodations or participating in a work environment that wasn't conducive to his or her ongoing success, and then making the decision to stop working at some point along the way. In a couple of instances, people unfortunately reported being terminated from their jobs, not on the basis of MS, at least not according to the employer, but the timing of that disclosure, followed by a fairly sudden layoff or termination, left the person feeling suspicious and wondering whether that decision may have been made on the basis of MS and just wasn't articulated as part of the reason for the termination. So we had a number of folks who ended up terminating their employment based on a negative reaction and a negative experience with disclosure. A couple of other folks made the decision not to disclose their MS and then decided to leave the workforce because by not disclosing their MS, they didn't have access to workplace accommodations, the employer didn't understand their needs, and their job performance suffered, and then they decided to terminate their employment or had their employment terminated sometime subsequent to that. So we really do see the mix of consequences ranging from positive reactions to no reactions to the consequence of having people needing to leave the workforce, and also including that variable reaction, which is a very interesting dynamic and probably not surprising, particularly in this study where the effects of MS vary over time. So might the reactions of coworkers and supervisors, and so might the ability of the worker to perform his or her job in the case of a chronic condition such as multiple sclerosis. Well, folks, I'm looking at my watch here. It looks like we've neared the end of our time together this morning, this evening, or this afternoon, whichever the case may be. It's been a great pleasure talking with you all about this disclosure issue. I think you can tell from the remarks and the findings and our experiences in working with people with the physical disabilities that disclosure is a highly personal and often complicated issue in the lives of Americans with disabilities. Certainly would underscore the sentiment mentioned by one of the respondents in one of our studies that knowledge is power, and so encouraging folks to learn more about their legal rights, about the obligation of disclosure as it applies to reasonable accommodation, understanding when it might be time to limit or delay disclosure being another important issue, and above all else, people's prerogative and encouraging people to maintain their own right to privacy and making that decision in the way that works best for each individual person, because disclosure is such a individualized and situationally bound decision to make that it's very important for the person himself or herself to decide whether, how, and on what terms to make that disclosure. Thank you again for tuning in, and wish you all well.